Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew, where I answer film-related questions submitted by members of the BMFI community. Today's question is, why are remakes so popular lately? Are there any examples of remakes that exceed the original? What makes a good remake? Well, there are a few different questions here, and I will try to take them in order. The first part being, why are remakes so popular lately? Well, I think remakes are so popular lately, first and foremost, for the same reason that comic book adaptations and expanded universe films and other adaptations are so popular. And that is they have pre-existing premises, pre-existing material, and most importantly, built-in audiences. At least that's the theory. The idea that a pre-existing property will facilitate the marketing and therefore the size of an audience or the size of audience that most big budget Hollywood productions require nowadays has been the sort of conventional wisdom for a number of decades in Hollywood, but it seems to be increasing in frequency and importance of late. And I think that has to do with, prior to COVID-19 anyway, the shifting nature of the business most Hollywood studios found themselves in, which was either acquiring pretty inexpensive, really relatively low budget movies, either by funding them, but more likely by purchasing the rights to distribute them at a festival like Sundance after they were made. There's one sort of low risk and infrequent reward, but for titles like that. But occasionally, one of those movies will strike big, in because of the relatively small budget or small distributing rights fee paid, the studio will make a killing. But either way, there's not a lot at stake. The other end of the spectrum is the movies with the budgets of 150, 200 million dollars, even more, that the studios are counting on to make 800 million or a billion or 1.2 billion dollars around the world in theaters. And for an expense like that, in the hope of a payday like that, you want to have as many of your bases covered as you can, and you want to minimize risk as much as you can. And one way the studios do that is with pre-existing properties. Well, the same is true with the remakes. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way. There was a remake a few years ago of The Magnificent Seven, for example, that didn't really attract audiences. And part of the reason probably is that much of the movie-going audience in 2016 didn't much care for Westerns, which many people consider to be an old genre, and didn't know that film from over 50 years earlier. So picking the property makes a difference. Disney has been mining its own catalog from the 80s and 90s and making live action. They call them live action. I think a better term is photoreal, because they use so many computer generated images that there's not a lot of live action in these movies, but they're photoreal adaptations of movies like The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast. They're animated hits from recent decades past. There, they are taking advantage of rapid advancements, tremendous advancements in computer effects and visual effects, and to tell a story in a way it couldn't have been told when it was first conceived. So part of the reason remakes are popular, and this has been the case throughout history, film history, is that technology exists that didn't exist previously to tell the story in a more convincing, more visually interesting, quote unquote, better way. Think of the 10 Commandments from 1956 with Charlton Heston was a remake. Cecil B. DeMille remade his own film because he had, the effects to do the parting of the Red Sea and the cast of thousands and Technicolor and all that. And he basically had newer and better and bigger tools to tell the same story with, and he wanted the chance to do that. So that's another reason why remakes are popular lately. The tremendous advancements in visual technology and visual effects, I should say, the technology used to make visual effects in movies is part of the reason why people are interested in revisiting things. But just because you can remake a film doesn't necessarily mean you should. I think a good example of a movie that was able to be, not because of technology, but because of standards and censorship or lack thereof, a movie like Rebecca that was recently remade for Netflix is, I think, probably much more faithful to the Daphne du Maurier novel, and therefore has things in it that the Alfred Hitchcock film from 1940 didn't. But sometimes being able to show everything or depict everything you want doesn't necessarily make a story better. Which leads us to the next part of the question: are there examples where remakes exceed the original? There are. And in some of those cases, the remake is not recognized, or I shouldn't say is not recognized, it's not known as a remake. The best example is The Maltese Falcon from 1941. I'm pretty sure that was the third version of the Dashiell Hammett novel to be made into a feature film in Hollywood, but that is the defining version of that film version of that story. And nobody knows or thinks about the two that came before it. So there's an example where the remake is better. Ocean's 11 from 2001, a tremendously entertaining movie with a really clever story, was, as I'm sure you know, a remake of the 1960 casino heist film starring Frank Sinatra and the rest of the Rat Pack. And that had their celebrity and a certain charm to it, but it wasn't nearly as visually interesting as the film made by Steven Soderbergh. It wasn't nearly as clever of a script, and the acting wasn't nearly as good as it was with the cast in the 2001 version. His Girl Friday, which is one of the Hallmark screwball comedies, was a remake of a 1931 film, The Front Page. The story of The Front Page has been turned into a movie numerous times, sometimes with a sort of gender switch, the way there is in His Girl Friday. The original Front Page has sort of the two main characters as men. His Girl Friday and another remake of it, which was not nearly as good, Switching Channels, has one of the characters be a woman, and it adds an additional element to it, but it's very much the same story. And His Girl Friday, I think most people would say, even though The Front Page has been made into a movie numerous times, including a version with Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, I think most people would say that of the versions of that story, His Girl Friday is the best film. Another example where the remake exceeds the original, I would say, is True Grit. The Coen brothers made True Grit in 2010, and it was very much a departure from the 1969 version starring John Wayne. Now, some people would say, including the Coen brothers, I think that they're not remaking the John Wayne movie. They are making a new movie based on the same source novel, and the John Wayne movie departed pretty liberally from the source novel, as Hollywood movies often did and do, and they were being more faithful to it. I'm sure that's true, but for the purposes of most moviegoers, and I think for the purposes of this discussion, it comes across as a film remake. And as such, I think it's a much better movie, the 2010 version the Coen brothers made, than the one starring John Wayne, despite all the sentimental value some of us might have for that old and classic but somewhat corny Western, if we're being honest. Finally, the last part of the question was, what makes a good remake? This is tough to say, I think. I think one of the answers is a good reason to make the remake. Whether it was the first version wasn't good, the first version was limited either by standards of censorship or filmmaking technology or some other element that sort of limited its potential, and a remake could better address that. I think that's something that good remakes sort of strive for. I think having the ability to at once say something new with the film, but also find the kind of the timeless or the universal aspects of its story. I think that is a good reason for a remake. And I think that there aren't that many movies, if you think about it, that fill that bill, that have on different levels, different things to say. There's an opportunity to say something new and also to restate or represent a more timeless type of theme or statement. And then I think also that there can be changes that would justify the remake of a movie, whether it's changes in the gender or other elements of identity of the characters, that there were certain stories that were told at a certain time when, for example, they're about someone with an occupation that at that time women weren't in that occupation and now they are. That could be an interesting way to do it. Or you know, a romance, and back in the day, Hollywood didn't tell stories about same-sex romances, and now that bringing that element might make a remake worth doing. Something fresh, or a new sort of you know, cultural moment or circumstance that makes something that had been relevant again. There are often movies that are about a fear of a new technology. Usually they're science fiction, but not always. And there are often new technologies coming up. Would there be any cause to remake a movie that was about, let's say, the fears of the cultural fears of television? A movie like A Face in the Crowd, about the current concerns over social media. I'm not advocating that, and I'm not about to go try that, but that sort of dynamic where there's a comparable or analogous, I guess, but different cultural moment might be a good reason to make a remake as well. But it's an interesting topic and one that I could obviously go on forever about. So I'm glad it was brought up, and I'd love to hear from folks about remakes that they really enjoy. And I'd also love to hear from folks if they have a film-related question they'd like me to try to answer. If you do, please visit the Ask Andrew page in the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. Who knows? Next time I could be answering your question.